Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our session for this evening. I'm Melanie Buschel. I'm the Development Director here at PGS, and what that means is that I have the pleasure and privilege of helping former pupils, former staff, and anyone else who's interested stay connected with the school. And I'm absolutely delighted that we've got two of our former pupils here speaking with us tonight. David Reed and Olivier Evans. They were a couple of years apart at school, but they were friends nevertheless, and they left in the 90s, and then later both ended up at the Foreign Office. Another thing they have in common is that both of their fathers are also connected with the school. So David's father, Keith, was a pupil here in the 50s and 60s, and Olivier's father, Tony Evans, was head here between 1982 and 1997. I know they've got some really brilliant stuff to share with us tonight, but first I'm going to hand over to our brilliant prefect, Ben, who's going to be chairing this evening. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So yes, as Ms. Buschel said, we are privileged this evening to be joined by two of our OPs, David Reed Mbe and Olivier Evans. David brings a wealth of knowledge regarding foreign policy, trade and climate issues, having worked as Deputy High Commissioner to Canada since 2018. He has also had diplomatic postings to Cyprus and France, being responsible for settlement negotiations and justice and home affairs cooperation. David received an MBE in 2016 for his crisis management work. Olivier has a track record of leadership in public policy and negotiation, having worked in the EU, the UK and internationally. He was appointed as Director of Communications at the Department for Exiting the European Union in 2019. Olivier currently works in a senior role at Drax Group, a major player in the field of renewable energy and sustainable biomass. Olivier will be discussing topics ranging from marketing and journalism to sustainability, climate change and COP26. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the talk where you will have the opportunity to pose your questions to our OPs. Please send your questions through via the Q&A tab, which will be open throughout the talk. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our OPs, David and Olivier.
In Tuvalu, we are living the realities of climate change, sea level rise, as you stand watching me today at COP26. We cannot wait for speeches when the sea is rising around us all the time. Climate mobility must come to the forefront. We must take bold, alternative action today to secure tomorrow. Faftailasi, Tuvalu Modetua. Climate change and sea level rise are deadly and existential threats to Tuvalu and low-lying atoll countries. We are sinking, but so is everyone else. And no matter if we feel the impacts today, like in Tuvalu, or in 100 years, we will all still feel the dire effects of this global crisis one day. In Tuvalu, our islands are sacred to us. They contain the mana of our people. They were the home of our ancestors. They are the home of our people today. And we want them to remain the home of our people into the future. This is why this call to you from Tuvalu is not just a political statement. It is a call that reverberates from our 8 islands and our 12,000 people to the international community.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for dialing on and listening to David and me this evening. Thank you, Ben, for chairing. I think this is a much more difficult format than I'm used to anyway, because I'm afraid, Ben, you're going to have to, as the chair, tell us whether we're sending everybody to sleep. I don't know how you judge that, given that everything is virtual, but that is your mission impossible that I'm pleased to give you if you choose to accept. I think just to set out where David and I are going to say a few opening words, and then also happy to take Q&A at the end. To begin with, I will want to set out very briefly what the stakes are around climate change right now, and why does this matter so much. David will talk to us about how COP26 fits into the whole process and why it matters and what the objectives were in government. And then he'll move on to give the far more interesting bit than I can do, which is the diplomatic perspective with the benefits of him being in Canada and working on climate change over there as part of his much wider remit. I'll talk a little bit about the private sector and my experience of what a renewable energy company can do to be part of a solution and not the problem. And then we'll look at next steps as to what COP achieved, what we need to do next in the public and private sector, and open that up to the floor. So if I can just start with a few opening remarks as to why this matters. The reality is the world and our globe is 1 degree warmer now than it was at the start of the 19th century before industrialization. That rate is now accelerating to the point where we are due to reach 1.5 degrees by 2030 unless we take drastic action. 40%, we have 40% more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now than we did 100 years ago. And without changing that, we're going to end up anything between 2.5% and 4%, 4 degrees more by the end of the century. Why does that matter? Lots of people think that actually having warmer weather, especially in countries like the UK, is actually quite an attractive prospect. And I'm sure David, sitting in Canada in a winter, probably sometimes feels the same. The reality is that the world geologically and climatically has always changed, as we know. Sitting here in Portsmouth today, if I'd been here 18,000 years ago, I would have been probably buried under a glacier and ice. But the reality is that the unintended consequences of industrialization were such that whilst people were understood the impact on their lungs and the quality of air at the time, of which sort of Dickensian novels describe pretty accurately, the reality is that the overall impact of that poor air quality was not understood. We can't ever really identify or pinpoint any specific natural disaster as being as a result of climate change. But what we can do is look at the trends that have been developing, look at that at a macro level and realize what is happening. 2010 decade, the last 10, that decade was the hottest decade on record. And that, of course, affects weather patterns. So heat waves are getting hotter, droughts are getting drier, storms are getting bigger, and surges are getting higher, floods are getting more common, and snowfall, somewhat counterintuitively, is getting heavier. So I'm not a scientist. I'm a public servant who is currently out in the private sector. And I never expected to be working on climate change in this way. In many respects, I wish I'd listened a little bit more to Mr. Harris, Mr. Taylor, Mr. Disley, Mr. Walsh, and all the other biology, chemistry and physics teachers who were actually trying to explain this to me at the time. But what we do know with science, and what even I can understand, is that if you have deforestation, it means that less CO2 is being absorbed in the atmosphere. If there is more heat, water expands and rises. If there are warmer conditions, water evaporates and humidity and rainfall increases. And more moisture in the air means that there's more snow when the temperatures are cold. So those basic climatic realities of what is the impact of heat and water is what leads to all of the problems that we are currently experiencing. Air pollution is worsening. If you look at our diplomatic colleagues in New Delhi or Beijing or Mexico, they have to deal with rather difficult circumstances. And that is not just confined to those cities, that is a global phenomenon. If you look at biodiversity, that is being jeopardized due to climatic changes. And to give you one example of when I was in Mexico and Latin America, the golden toad is my favorite example of Costa Rica, an amphibian that was only discovered by humans and identified in the 1960s, whereby we were able to count thousands of them in Costa Rica due to the wonderful conditions of rainforests and cloud mists that Costa Rica had in the 1980s. But those have now disappeared and they are now extinct. And that can be attributed to many species, to which some scientific analyses indicate that there could be 15 of those amphibians, but actually about between 15 and 37% of the animal species is under jeopardy by the end of this century. So whilst we have all of these climatic features and tendencies, coral reefs dying, if you look at the Great Barrier Reef that's lost half of its reef since 1995, mosquito spreading, the impact on migration and the fact that people have to leave their land in Africa and other places in the world due to starvation, crops being damaged, etc. These are real life examples where people's well-being and livelihood and lives and animals and our globe are all being drastically affected by the accelerating nature of climate change. For me and many others, and hence the COP26 that David's about to talk about, you know, we can't put our head in the sand anymore. The reality is many wise people, including Prince Charles, Al Gore, others who spoke about this 30, 40 years ago, people are starting to understand that this is the reality. As the French president said, with a poor pun, there is no plan or planet B. So we have to act now. And that's what COP26 and what this global effort is all about. Over to David.
Thanks, Ollie. So Ollie's talked a bit about the science and the context. I'm going to talk a bit about where the Glasgow Climate Summit, also known as COP26, came in. But before I do, I just wanted to say what a pleasure it is to be talking to several OPs, to current students, and to see Ollie again. So I have very fond memories of many of those teachers that you mentioned there, Ollie, including Mr. Harris, who I think actually taught both my dad and myself at PGS. And I also have a 10-year-old nephew who's just started, so the links remain pretty strong. For me, COP26 was probably one of the most exciting issues and the most rewarding issues that I've worked on in my 20-year diplomatic career. And I think in terms of the importance and the link to my own sort of personal values, I can't think of many other things where it's been such a privilege to work on. So what is COP26? So for almost 3 decades, the UN, United Nations, has been bringing together almost every country on Earth for global climate summits. COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and this was the 26th annual Conference of the Parties, hence COP26. The UK was the presidency and the summit was hosted in Glasgow. This was the biggest summit the UK has ever hosted. So we had 38,000 delegates from 194 countries coming to Glasgow at the height of a global pandemic, 120 world leaders, 2 years of preparation for 2 weeks of really intensive negotiations. And as we'll come on to in a second, I think it was something that could not have been delivered virtually, could not have been done in a hybrid way. And I think getting those people there and delivering the result we did was a real success for the UN and for the UK. So COP26 was particularly important because this was the 5th COP since the landmark Paris Agreement of COP21. So COP21 basically set the ambition to limit global warming to at least 2 degrees as a maximum, but ideally as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. And the reason that's important is because, as Ollie outlined before, every 0.1 degree really matters in terms of the practical impacts on people's lives. So I'm looking out the window at the moment at a very snowy Ottawa with about 4 or 5 foot of snow. But I think in Canada, we're already feeling the impacts of climate change. And that ranges from the wildfires that struck in July and August. And I remember flying down in a plane into Calgary and not being able to see anything because of dust, and then spending most of my time locked up inside because it just wasn't safe to breathe the air. But it also ranges to impacts on Indigenous communities in Canada. So one of my first trips out of Ottawa was up to the Arctic, and I spent a few days there actually presenting a deed of gift around the wrecks of the Franklin ships. But I heard from several people there some of the real challenges that come from basically the tundra, the frozen tundra melting, and the collapse of infrastructure and the impacts it has on hunting grounds. So it affects everyone in Canada, from north to south, from east to west. And I think we saw some of these impacts across the world in the run-up to COP26, with the floods in Germany, with the wildfires in Australia and elsewhere in the world. So under the Paris Agreement, countries committed to bring forward commitments called nationally determined contributions, where they said we will reduce our emissions by this amount by 2030. And they agreed every 5 years they'd come back and take stock, and COP26 was that first moment. The problem was, going into COP26, if you looked at those targets, they were going to deliver warming of about 2.6 degrees, which would be potentially catastrophic for the world. So the challenge at COP26 was to get enough commitments and enough ambition from the international community to get back on track towards as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. The Prime Minister talked about make or break, the last best chance, and it really felt like that. So what was COP26 trying to achieve? Well, there were 4 main things. The first was to deliver those ambitious short-term targets, because the decade up to 2030 is particularly critical in terms of turning the curve. The second thing was to get as many countries as possible to sign up to longer-term net zero commitments, so getting carbon emissions down to effectively net zero by 2050. So this was all part of the ambition piece, getting the countries to commit to much more ambitious, much more rapid reductions in carbon emissions. The second thing was ensuring that there was enough finance to back this up. And when I talk about finance, I mean 2 things. The first is the money that needs to go from developed countries to developing countries to fund that shift towards renewables, and also to prepare for the impacts of climate change, e.g. through flooding defences, etc., but also through the much bigger pot of money that needs to be mobilised from the public sector. And Ollie touched on this a second ago, but it hits every part of our business sector in the UK, and particularly the financial sector, the banks, the pension funds, the insurers, where we need to mobilise the much greater resources they have to support the transition to a decarbonised economy. And I think Mark Carney, who wears multiple hats at the moment, but is one of the sort of central figures in potentially Canadian politics, and also a key person in the UK, given his role as the Governor of the Bank of England, has been absolutely instrumental in that. We wanted to get 100 billion pounds of international private finance through country. We wanted to get $100 billion of government finance mobilised, but $130 trillion of private finance. And the final goal of the conference was to get the Paris rulebook finalised. So this is the set of rules, runs to several hundred pages, which sets out exactly how countries need to track their emissions, to report those emissions, to set targets, to mobilise finance. So this was a real challenge. Every COP since Paris had tried to finalise the Paris rulebook. No one had managed it. There were some really difficult issues around things like how you account for carbon offsets, how you ratchet ambition. So going into COP26 in the middle of a global pandemic, needing to get countries to ramp up their ambitions, needing to get finance mobilised, and needing to finalise the Paris rulebook, all huge challenges. Which brings me on to the diplomatic perspective. So what was the UK role? So we were president, so we were hosting the summit itself. And the idea was, over the 2 years that ran up to it, we wanted to build as much of a sense of momentum as possible, so that you had key developed countries in particular amongst the G7 announcing big ambitious targets which would help others move, and announcing big ambitious targets in terms of the money they were mobilising, which would support developing countries to themselves shift towards renewable energy and increase their ambition in terms of emissions reductions. We wanted to mobilise the private sector, and we wanted to mobilise civil society, so it was a whole of society effort. We also needed to finalise that rule book, and we wanted to get as much of that work done as possible before COP26, understanding that really it was the 2 weeks in particular, the face-to-face negotiations, that were going to be crucial. Put simply, the goal was to keep 1.5 degrees alive, which, given where we were going into the summit, with organisations like the Carbon Brief predicting the world on a pathway to 2.6 degrees, was a massive challenge. And we also need to do all that complicated logistical work just to host the summit in the first place. So I talked about 38,000 delegates. You had 38,000 delegates descending on Glasgow, coming from all over the world, and needing to deliver a summit which was safe during COVID was a huge challenge. And it involved every bit of the UN's network and the UK's network in terms of practical things like getting vaccines delivered to those countries, delegations that didn't have access to vaccines, bringing in testing requirements, just making sure that we could safely deliver this conference with all the face-to-face contact there needed to be, but doing it in a way which didn't cause real issues in terms of the COVID risk. It was a whole of government effort, so it involved my bit of government, the Foreign Office, in terms of engaging with our international partners. It involved Number 10 in particular, in terms of the key political pressure that the Prime Minister and others could bring, the alliances they could form. It involved the COP unit in Cabinet Office, the bit of government which coordinates line departments in terms of making sure that we had a clear strategy and a clear set of deliverables leading up to the summit. It involved the Treasury in terms of all the work they needed to do with the banking sector to mobilise that finance, and it involved the Department for the Environment and others. There was a big domestic element and a big international element. Domestic because in order for the UK to have credibility, we needed to walk the talk. We needed to set ambitious targets for the UK so that we could credibly lobby and encourage others to do the same. So to give a couple of examples of that, the UK shifted its 2030 target up to 68% emissions reductions by 2030 on 1990 levels, which is pretty much the most ambitious target in the world. They also had to produce a clear plan to get there. So you may have heard of the Prime Minister's 10-point plan for net zero, where that set out all the practical things that we needed to do to be able to credibly deliver that ambition, including investments in hydrogen, nuclear power, offshore wind in particular, new policies on banks and insurers declaring climate risk, new policies on phasing out internal combustion engine vehicles, all the things that the economy needed to do to get the UK onto a clear and credible path to net zero. So a big domestic push to give us international credibility. And then at the international level, we needed to lobby bilaterally with key partners, work through the G7 and G20 and other big international organisations to get progress, and to try and overcome some of those real geopolitical challenges that we were facing. So going into COP26, at that point we had President Trump, the president at the time in the United States, who had committed to leaving the Paris Agreement. We were working through state governments and other parts of the US system to try and increase ambition. You had real geopolitical tensions with China at the time, a key partner if you're going to deliver a global response to climate change, and a huge amount going on in terms of how much bandwidth and political attention COVID was putting out of the system. So I think that sort of paints a picture of a really challenging context, both in terms of the science going into it, the geopolitical situation, and just the sheer complexity of getting all these different bits of government aligned to produce this summit. And for those 2 years, this became pretty much the #1 priority for every UK embassy and High Commission across the world. So I remember my boss, the High Commissioner, and myself getting a letter from Number 10 setting out how important this was and how they wanted us to mobilise the whole of the diplomatic effort to make this work. So I'm just going to speak for a couple of minutes in terms of how we did it and my personal role, because that's, I think, one of the things that I'm obviously closest to, and I think it's probably one of the areas of work that has been most satisfying in my time in Canada. So how do we in Canada work towards getting Canada in the right place for COP26? So there were 3 or 4 things we did which are really important. The first is the obvious point of basically setting a strategy, and a strategy which took into account the context in Canada. So in Canada, sort of 3 or 4 key bits of context. I mean, stating the obvious, it is a vast country. Power is very dispersed between provincial governments and the federal government. Secondly, it is a country which has huge oil and gas reserves. 10% of its GDP is from exports of fossil fuels from the oil sands. So there's a lot of people's jobs and livelihoods that depend on being able to continue to do this. A really important relationship with the US. And so that was something we needed to factor in and work around. And sort of finally, and most positively, a sense that public opinion was shifting in the country. So even though you had this commitment to needing to support the oil sands in terms of the economic importance to Canadian prosperity, you had public opinion progressively shifting and seeing climate change as something where they wanted more ambitious action from Canada. So for Canada, we focused on thinking what we could do in terms of real areas where we could shift the dial, and they included a real push on a much more ambitious Canadian 2030 emissions target, getting Canada to double the amount of money it put towards developing countries in terms of climate finance, and then much more ambition on things like moving towards zero emission vehicles. So that was the first thing, getting the strategy right and focusing on the right areas. The second thing was building a team. So Ollie talked a bit about how he's not a scientific expert. I'm certainly not a climate expert, but we did hire in some specialist expertise so that we could have a team of 2 or 3 people who were absolute experts on climate change in the Canadian context and could give us the right advice. But I think more important than that was mobilising the whole of our network in Canada. So getting every bit of the UK's diplomatic footprint in Canada mobilised towards this. So we had our defence advisor working with the Canadian Defence Ministry on how they could contribute to net zero. We had our Department for International Trade colleagues working on clean tech. We had our Science Innovation Network working on hydrogen standards. We had all the senior leadership in the mission and our consulates across Canada working towards this ambition. And we had a big sort of comms push to support this. So that was the second thing, getting the team and the network together. The third thing was working through others. So we are, a UK diplomatic network in Canada. We have influence, we have access, we have expertise, but we single-handedly cannot move the Canadian government into a more ambitious place. So we needed to work through others. What we did was build some important relationships with Canadian climate champions. We chose 26 Canadian climate champions from across Canada, ranging from those who were well-known environmentalists to those who worked in the innovative part of the oil and gas sector, to ministers, to opinion formers, to editors, making sure we had people who had access to the key parts of the decision-making apparatus. And then myself and others built personal relationships with those we thought we really needed to shift towards a different place. One of the real challenges of doing this was in normal times, we would be doing this through traditional diplomacy, but because we were at the height of a COVID pandemic, there was a limit towards what we could do in terms of face-to-face stuff. Canada was a particularly cautious approach to COVID with a lot of restrictions, and it was very hard to get face-to-face meetings. So it needed quite a lot of creativity. I remember doing a lot of skate and ski diplomacy where you would meet a Canadian minister and go for a skate or a cross-country ski because they were happy to have an outdoor meeting, but they wouldn't meet inside. And when you needed that candid advice or a favour, you just needed to get out there. And I think it was great to see the network get really creative and do all the sort of face-to-face engagement that we needed to get the Canadian system fully aligned and supportive. Fourth thing was the importance of communications to back all this up. So we had a strategy, we had a team, we had a network of allies, but we wanted to have a reach across Canada. And we worked very hard with organisations which has much greater reach than we did as a diplomatic network to do that. So I remember partnering with a charity called Earth Rangers that has a really popular app in Canada called Earth Rangers Missions. And we used that, for example, to set up a series of climate change missions that teenagers could do. And we knew those teenagers were likely going to be talking to their parents. And this was a great way of sort of building up a bit of profile. But we ran things like cross-Canada photo competitions. We looked at, we replaced our previous Jaguars with electric Jaguars. So we had an electric fleet. We tried to walk the talk as a mission, so we shifted our pension fund investments towards sustainable investments. our shift towards a new office building. We made sure that we could credibly claim to be the greenest building in the FCO. We did all the stuff which meant that, like the UK was domestically walking the talk with its international partners, we in Canada could do the same. And the final thing, in addition to that, is I think once we built this strategy, we identified opportunities where we could work with Canada internationally to help shift others. So as well as trying to shift Canadian domestic ambition, we were giving Canada a platform to work with international partners and push in areas where we had common expertise and priorities. So a big focus of that was powering past coal. Canada's got a great story to tell in terms of how it shifted away from coal towards hydroelectric and renewable forms, and we work very closely with Canada to do that internationally with partners. So that was how we did it. We'll come in a bit to sort of outcomes of COP26, but just to say briefly for Canada, I think the success that we had was getting Canada's emissions targets reductions up from 30% to 40 to 45%. The UK can't claim all the credit for that. The Canadian government put a huge amount of work into this. The US lobbied heavily. The UK worked very heavily. But I think what we did do was provide the right expertise at the right moments on things like how to draft net zero legislation, how to build infrastructure that supports electric vehicles. I think we supported that effort in a really important way. We pushed very hard as the UK on doubling climate finance. And I think Canada's commitment on that at the G7 Leaders Summit in Cornwall made a big difference and came at exactly the right time. And we managed to sort of agree a whole range of outcomes on zero emission vehicles, hydrogen, fuel, a whole range of areas which gave Canada the space that it needed to do this. So I think we did our part, and I think it strengthened the bilateral relationship. We've raised a couple of glasses since COP26, and with the Canadian negotiating team, I feel like they felt that they had a really good COP26, and they came back having shown what Canada could do and showing a credible plan for how they could increase their own ambition. So that was the sort of the diplomatic perspective. We'll come back in a second to sort of COP26 as a whole, but I'll hand over to Ollie to talk a bit about the private sector perspective.
Thank you, David. I mean, what's really striking in all of what David's explained is actually how so many of the techniques of what David was having to do in government, how similar it is actually in the private sector. So one of the things that I noticed, having gone for a couple of years to Drax from government, was actually how a lot of the diplomatic sort of skills and negotiating skills and the chance meetings, skating or doing the cross-country stuff is very similar in whichever sector that you are in. I think from a private sector perspective, this COP was probably the one that engaged stakeholders the most. So, as David said, civil society and businesses as well as government. And that is absolutely key, because the reality is you can have as many pieces of paper agreed by government as you want and by a series of governments. But actually, if those pieces of paper aren't turned into reality by civil society and business, nothing is going to progress. Private companies, I think, understood for this COP in the UK that they had to be part of the solution and not be seen to be part of a problem, which I think historically, especially energy companies, had seen to be. So kicking that carbon habit, as David Attenborough said, was something that private companies, especially energy companies, needed to show that they were really engaged, and were able to produce the money and the innovation to make technology and new technology, climate-friendly technology, a possibility. To do that, of course, I don't think there's any private company that would say that that is possible if government and governments at a multilateral level or individual level, if they are unwilling to provide the certainty and clarity that is needed in terms of vision, ambition, regulation, and certainty, that is absolutely key for that to happen. I think if I used the Drax example of what Drax did, a bit like David was saying, a lot of what a private company does is try to nudge governments and get them to make some decisions, especially if you're president of a COP in the case of the UK. So there was a lot of upfront engagement, both with the UK and with other governments of other countries, to try and make sure that the offer that a private company like Drax could offer was actually heard, understood, and then integrated when it came to looking at different types of action required in climate change for the declaration at the end. One of the key things for Drax was to make sure that, be it pump storage hydro or sustainable biomass, carbon capture storage, which are three fundamental elements of the business model to Drax, that these were all integrated in a way that meant that after COP, we as a company were able to invest and take forward concrete projects, be it in the UK or abroad, to make sure that this becomes a reality. Now, if you're going to talk about that as a business, Drax as an example is a perfect example of a company that is moving in that transition. So Drax, for those of you who've been to Yorkshire, Drax used to be Europe's biggest coal power station. It moved across to sustainable biomass and is trying to move to the next level of sustainable biomass by doing something called negative emissions, which is fundamentally pumping CO2 back into the sea where old oil and gas fields used to be. So in order to do that, we needed to make sure that COP26 recognised that carbon capture storage was actually finally a technology that would be invested in both in the UK and in other countries. So that was a clear objective for the company to make sure that that happened. What that required was, as I mentioned, lots of upfront engagement, lots of thought leadership, working with other companies, working with academics, working with the media, making sure that government directly and indirectly was hearing what the offer was for a company like Drax, and trying to get coalitions of companies together. As David said about climate finance, how could you bring together a coalition of either heavy industry, industrialized companies that would struggle to decarbonize without negative emissions, to climate finance, whereby talking to banks, insurers, to be able to actually put the money on the table and make these projects a reality. I think, as David said, COVID made it very hard because David and I sort of overlapped as well in Canada, because with Drax, Drax operates in North America. So what's interesting is, as he talked about hydroelectric power, we ourselves were talking to the Canadian authorities and the Americans about trying to talk to the British administration about the importance of it as well. So we were talking to other states and governments of other countries to put pressure on the UK, as well as us talking to the UK directly, all for the honourable cause of making sure that the wider green energy mix that is required for the successful decarbonisation of the energy sector, for it to become a reality. The reason that it matters is that whilst lots of public opinion and the media talk a lot about solar and wind, the reality is, with technology as it is right now, when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, electricity becomes unpredictable. And because we don't have the necessary storage, battery storage, in order to be able to keep that together, the reality is that we need different types of renewable and sustainable energy to be able to make sure that we have a greener energy system. So sustainable biomass, which is fundamentally commercially growing trees for manufacture and using offshoots for energy, hydroelectric in that sense, pump storage, which is fundamentally pushing water up a hill and back down again to create momentum. All of those techniques that are actually quite accessible to lots of different countries in the world is a really important element to being able to meet our targets. Yesterday, the EU published, more controversially, gas as being a sustainable rather than renewable, but sustainable energy source for the short term in order to meet targets, the 2050 targets and net zero. And it also published nuclear and said that nuclear was also a sustainable, as opposed to renewable energy, which has led to lots of debate in the last couple of days as to whether that is required. In terms of the actual COP26 itself, final point, Drax wanted to be part of a solution. So lots of roundtables, lots of talks, lots of seminars, lots of joint talks with Japanese companies, American companies, Canadian companies, in order to show that actually private businesses and energy companies and other innovative technological industries could get together and actually deliver the vision with the certainty of the pledges being made by the 200 governments. And to give you an example, the former Australian Prime Minister went to see one of our pump storage facilities up in Scotland, 2 hours from Glasgow, to have an idea as to how pump storage could actually be replicated and upscaled in several parts of the world, including Australia, as part of a more sustainable, wider energy mix. So those are the sort of approaches that we took as a private company in order to try and make COP a success in terms of pledges being met with business realities.
I'm going to give just 2 minutes on the question of whether COP26 was a success or not. And it's going to be my personal take, and it's going to be a mix of optimism and a dose of realism. So I think in terms of COP26, I would say if we had been offered that outcome 3 months beforehand, we would take it, because it delivered, first of all, a conference. Just getting the conference to happen in person was a huge challenge, and delivering it in a way which produced a result and didn't have major COVID issues was a success in itself. Secondly, more importantly, it did deliver the ambition that we'd set out for in terms of getting countries to commit to net zero 2050 targets. 2 years ahead of COP26, about 30% of the world's economy was committed to net zero. By the time of the end of COP26, we'd got that to 90%. So a big step forward in terms of long-term ambition. And in the short term, a lot of much increased 2030 target commitments from countries like the US, from Canada, from both the developed and developing world. So much greater ambition. Third thing I think was a success was some really important initiatives which got kicked off in the margins at COP26. Big important initiatives on deforestation, electric vehicles, private finance, methane in particular, a US and EU led push on methane, which has really got some momentum behind it. Fourth, I talked at the start about the challenges about getting the Paris climate rulebook agreed. I think probably 3 months out from COP26, if we're being completely honest, we didn't think we would get it done. Actually, we managed to get it done, and the Glasgow Climate Pact, which was the outcome of those 2 weeks of intensive negotiations, finalised all the important bits of the Paris rulebook, including some really important and robust rules on things like offsets and transparency targets. And finally, public consciousness. I think one of the things I'm struck by is how many conversations I've had with friends and family over the last couple of years on climate change, and how much coverage there was, for example, on Sky News running up to the summit, and how many people who I don't think would ordinarily be interested in climate change watched those sort of emotional last stages of the negotiations when we were arguing over language on fossil fuels in the text, and where we got that final reference to coal, the first reference in any international climate change text about phasing down from coal. And all that public consciousness, I think, has translated into both a growing realization in the private sector that there are huge benefits and getting ahead of the curve on climate change, and being the innovative companies that are making their policies align with net zero and developing the tech that the world's going to need to get there, but also in terms of those personal commitments. So I remember talking to a couple of friends afterwards. Ollie will remember a couple of them. Mike Stoner, for example, if I can name his name, who is one of the classic meat-eating OPs committed to going vegan. I know friends and colleagues who've gone to who've shifted to zero emission vehicles after the summit because they were looking for something positive that they could do. So I think in addition to all those international commitments by countries, the personal commitments and the personal attention this has got across the whole of society has been a big benefit. So I would say overall a big success, but with one dose of realism and one big caveat is that it depends entirely on delivery of these commitments. So Ollie talked about commitments on a piece of paper. Getting those commitments transformed into practical action is the challenge now for the next 8 months or so in the run up to COP27 and beyond that. And I think if you look again back at the sort of the headline target for COP26, which was keeping 1.5 degrees alive, we went into COP26 with the world on track for hitting a 2.6 degree rise by the end of the century. We came out of COP26 with a possibility of getting that down to 2.4 if the countries that are committed to their 2030 emissions targets did what they were going to do. If all the countries collectively that committed to net zero deliver what they've set out to do, we can get it to 1.8. So there is now this pathway to get down to 1.5 degrees, which wasn't there beforehand, but it is a really, really ambitious pathway that depends on a lot of very ambitious commitments being met across the world at a time when it's easy to get distracted by other issues, at a time when it's easy to be economically selfish, at a time when it's easy to focus on short-term political objectives. So I say, from my perspective, sitting in Canada, COP26 felt like a success for UK-Canada. It felt like a big success for global climate ambition, but it depends totally on delivery, and that's where all the effort is focused now. Over to you, Ollie, for your final words.
Thanks, David. I think given that I'm temporarily out of the diplomatic service, I'll let you do the intrinsic ingredient of being a diplomat, which is being optimistic. I'll probably put that dose of realism as well. I think from a business perspective, it was successful to an extent in that big commitments were made, especially in terms of from an energy perspective, a wider energy mix. And for a company like Drax that made a pledge and ahead of schedule moved away from coal and scrap coal, to see that as a pledge at COP26, so that was a global thing and not just a naive company doing that, was a huge sense of relief in many respects, because one of the problems we have is everybody knows that they have to jump. It's just that nobody wants to jump without everybody else jumping at the same time, and that sort of courageous leadership is what is required from politicians, businesses and civil society. I think the only word of caution I would say, and then we can see if there's time for any questions, is that I do worry about two things. One is the multilateral system, and having made all these pledges, what are the consequences if countries renege on them? And do we actually have in the 21st century international institutions that are fit for purpose, whereby countries actually have to follow those obligations? And what is the consequence if it doesn't? So that's the multilateral international concern. The second is the local level implementation plan. Now, we all have our own anecdotes of what we want to do, but when I talk to people who want to put solar panels on their roof and councils stop them because it's not in keeping with the local area, or when someone wants to be able to plug an electric car that they've bought, but they're not allowed to because you're not allowed to put a cable cover over a pavement. when you want to recycle, but the council doesn't actually have the right recycling systems, etc. The reality is there are hundreds of these examples in councils in the UK, let alone across the world. If we do not get that right at local implementation level, then the reality is we will not meet all of those of our ambition, because 1.5 is going to be very hard to reach. And as David set out, there are a lot of ifs there. And those ifs will be done if everybody does what they say that they will do and implement it fully. And now comes the time where local councils, wherever they are in the world, and national governments actually have to be talking together to make sure that those pieces of paper become a reality in our daily world. And so that is my major concern, is how do we actually turn this into a reality? How long do we have? And I guess, is our slightly consumer-based society where everybody wants the latest gadget, is our actual intrinsic society, especially in the developed world, set up to actually make climate change targets a reality and a success? Or do we have to have a much bigger cultural change as to how we work? But what we do know is, like Michael Stoner and others who have gone vegan, the reality is we will only make progress if everybody makes the effort at an individual level. Because whilst one person's individual effort won't make a difference, if everybody does the same, then we will make one hell of a difference. And that's the challenge that we've got. I'll stop there.
Thank you, David and Olivier. That was brilliant to hear both the diplomatic and the private perspective to approaching climate action, and how this can cause both benefits and problems when trying to approach summits like COP26. Now we move into the Q&A section of the talk, so viewers can pose their questions to our OPs. If you have a question, please feel free to put it in the live chat and I will select the best ones. First, if I turn to Daisy and Sam, if you've got some questions to pose.
I'll go first. I was just wondering, sorry, has COVID helped or hindered the positive journey towards climate change? I mean, both diplomatically and environmentally, because it's had such vast differences. People were inside for a long time, there was less emissions, but also in terms of communication diplomatically amongst countries with different responses, different vaccination rates and things like that.
Yeah, so I think there's a positive and a negative. So I think one of the things that COVID showed was quite how much the world can do when they really put the resources of the international community and the private sector behind it. So developing that portfolio of vaccines that quickly and getting them into people's arms, there's still a bit to do in the developing world, but I think it was a huge international effort which showed quite how much can be done if the resources are combined and there is international coordination. I think similarly in terms of the economic response to COVID, the sheer amount of international and domestic effort that went into shoring up the economies and making sure that COVID didn't lead to some catastrophic economic collapse, which it could have done, I think shows you that where there is a will, there is a way. So in terms of sort of the top objectives on COVID, which is developing a vaccine, ensuring there's equitable distribution, and making sure that the world economy continues in a way that supports stability. I think the world showed what it could do when there is real political will behind it. I think that's the positive. I think the negatives have been that, I mean, COVID has obviously drawn out a lot of sort of political attention and bandwidth, and it is hard for political leaders to focus on, issues as big as COVID at the same time as the sort of long, sustained, sometimes painful action that's needed to get towards net zero. I think the way around it is to flip how you see that path from something that costs a lot of money to something that actually is going to create a lot of economic opportunity. So I think that the political narrative, which I believe in and support, that actually the countries that move quickest on this are going to reap the economic benefits. I think that's the way to do it, to keep people focused on the opportunities that come from this, because it is true there are basically two alternatives. A, you put your head in the sand and you wait for climate change impacts to be so dramatic that there is no choice for the world to act very quickly, and you have this incredibly painful economic transition which is going to have huge impact on people's jobs. This is the unplanned transition. Or B, you plan for this, you build up your renewable economies, you phase out fossil fuels in a sustainable way, and you develop the tech that's going to get you ahead of the rest of the world for the benefit of all. So I think I'd see it in sort of positive and a negative, but what do you think, Ollie?
No, I agree. I agree. I think my only concern is that domestic democracy is at a domestic level, and politicians have to think about survival in elections, and it's very hard at times to make long-term choices, both at home and also in the interests of other countries, including developing countries, when you sometimes have a lot of pressure at home in a short term to make popular decisions to get re-elected. But that would be a sort of a slightly cynical political view.
Not sure how much time we have left, but I just want to quickly ask. You were talking, Ollie, just at the end of your bit before we went into questions about the impact of individuals. What would you say the impact of billionaires like Jeff Bezos and their joyrides to space has on the environment? Because Amazon is a very big contributor to climate change and deforestation.
This is where people have to make choices between economics and climate, and whereas I totally agree with David on a business level, we can make climate technology become an opportunity for businesses and for countries to grip it. People have to make choices about where they are making their own purchases. I mean, the thing with the internet, of course, is that people are buying more and more stuff, not less. So whilst there isn't a carbon footprint of shops in the same way, so you could argue that, you know, an Amazon package or whatever is better. Of course, people have to make their choices, and very often cheap is the thing that dictates people's choices, and some people have to make that choice. The space race issue, I think there's always been that accusation about, and even when you go back to the 60s, about whether the space was relevant or not. I don't know what the unintended benefits are of people joyriding into space will be, but the unintended scientific progress that was made from going into space as astronauts in the 60s was huge in terms of understanding our climate and our Earth and everything else. So whilst I totally understand those space races for joyrides might seem to be a bit frivolous, you know, you've seen the film Don't Look Up, probably, of you know, there being an alternative planet for us to go and live on. You know, that's for the birds, but I wouldn't be able to commit and criticize fully people, because I think there's a distinction to be made, whether it creates problems and encourages more people to actually go into fossil fuels and ignore climate challenges is another thing. But I don't think per se it undermines the overall climate challenge that we've got and the actions that we have to take.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ollie. Really sadly, I think we're going to have to bring this evening to a close. We've hit 8 o'clock, which is the time we said we were going to finish. And So yeah, so sorry that we can't go through more of the questions. I know that Ben's having some technical problems as well, so that's why I'm jumping in to round things off. But just leaves for me to say to Olivier and David, thank you so much for giving up your time tonight and for giving up your time to put this all together. And it's been a fascinating insight into what's been happening in the climate change world in the last, well, forever really, and what there is to come. So thank you again, and thank you to everybody who's tuned in for it. Okay, good night.